I'm Dave Sleet, and this is a Sleep Report. In the beginning, there was God, and God is brilliant. He's better than anyone you could ever imagine. You can't find anyone as brilliant as him. And so God decided to make the world. So that's what he did. Because that's the sort of thing God can do. And God is king of the world. Because he's God. And because he made it. God decided to make some people to live in the world. So that's what he did. He made two people to start with, Adam and Eve. You may have heard of them. He made a lovely garden for them to live in called the Garden of Eden, and he told them to look after it. And God loved them, and they loved God, and everything was lovely. Lovely. So there were Adam and Eve living the good life in the Garden of Eden, spending time with God and looking after the garden, like he said, and generally having a good time. And they all lived happily ever after. Except they didn't, because it all went very, very wrong. One day, Eve came across a snake. And the snake started talking to her. Now, I reckon Eve would have been a bit surprised to meet a talking snake, but we don't know what she thought about it, because the Bible doesn't tell us. What the Bible does tell us is that she listened to what the snake said, which was not a very good idea at all. The snake said to her, "Did God really say that you must not eat the fruit from any tree in the garden?" And Eve said to the snake, "We may eat any fruit from the trees in the garden, but God told us you must not eat the fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden. You must not even touch it, or you will die." Because that is what God had said to Adam, except that he hadn't said the bit about not touching the tree. Then the snake did a very, very bad thing. He said to Eve, "You will not die. God knows that if you eat the fruit from that tree, you will learn about good and evil, and you will become like God." Which, reading between the lines, means you shouldn't trust God. You don't need God to decide what's right and wrong. You can be in charge of your own lives. But they should have trusted God, because he's God. And he loved them, and God was in charge of their lives. He's the king of the world, after all. Unfortunately, Eve listened to the snake. She decided not to trust God, and she ate the fruit. Then she gave some of it to Adam, and he ate it too. He didn't trust God either, and that was the worst thing that has ever happened in the history of the world. God said that Adam and Eve would die if they ate the fruit, and they did. Well, they didn't die physically until years later, but straight away they died spiritually, which means the perfect relationship that they had with God was broken. They had to leave the Garden of Eden, and they couldn't be close to God like they had been. They were separated from him, and from then on, all human beings would be separated from God too. It was a terrible, terrible thing. But God hadn't given up on his people. This wasn't the end of the story. God had a big plan. A plan to rescue the whole world. A while later, after Cain and Abel and Noah and the floods and the Tower of Babel, and you can read all about that in the Bible, along came a man called Abraham. God had chosen Abraham for the next stage of his big plan to rescue the world. God made some promises to Abraham. He promised that Abraham's descendants would be God's people, that God would give them a land to live in, and that God would bless them. They would be God's people, living in God's place with God's blessing. Remember that. God's people, in God's place, with God's blessing. It might come up again. So, the first thing that was needed for Abraham was to have a son. Children are, after all, the first step in getting yourself some descendants. The problem was Abraham and his wife didn't have any children, and they were old. I mean, really old. No, older than your parents. Even older than your grandparents. But that couldn't stop God because he's God. God promised that they'd have a son, and they did. And they called him Isaac. And when he had grown up, Isaac had 2 sons, and one of them was called Jacob. And when he had grown up, Jacob had lots of sons, 12 of them. Now that's a lot of sons. Reuben was the eldest of Jacob's sons, with Simeon and Levi the next in line, Naphtali and Issachar, with Asher and Dan. Zebulun and Gad took the total to 9. Jacob and son. Benjamin and Judah, which leaves only 1. Jacob and son. Joseph, Jacob's favourite son. Jacob and son. Sorry, I got a bit carried away there. Won't happen again. Promise. A crash of drums, a flash of light. Sorry. Where was I? Oh yes. Joseph was Jacob's favourite son, and he knew it, and his brothers knew it. And they didn't like it at all. And Joseph had some dreams about one day all his brothers would bow down to him, and he decided to tell them about it. And they didn't like that, so they sold him as a slave and told Jacob he'd been killed by a wild animal. They weren't the greatest brothers in the world. I hope you treat your brothers better than that. The people that they sold Joseph to took him to Egypt. And to cut a long story short, Joseph ended up more or less in charge of Egypt. As you do. Well, you do if it's part of God's big plan to rescue the world anyway. Then, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt looking for food, and they found Joseph alive and well and more or less in charge of Egypt, which was a big surprise. So they told Jacob that Joseph was still alive, and the whole family moved to Egypt and lived there. Now, about 400 years later, Jacob's descendants were still living in Egypt. By now they were known as the Israelites, and there were quite a lot more of them. When Jacob's family moved to Egypt, there were about 70 of them. But after 400 years, there were a lot more than that. There may even have been about 2.5 million. But the Bible doesn't tell us exactly. Anyway, there were a lot. But the new king of Egypt, who was called Pharaoh, had made the Israelites work as slaves, which wasn't very nice for the Israelites. So God called a man called Moses to lead the Israelites. God told Moses that he had chosen the Israelites to be his people, and he would be their God, just like he'd promised Abraham all those years ago. So the Israelites were God's people, but they didn't have their own place, and it didn't feel much like God had blessed them. It was time for the next part of God's big plan to rescue the world. So God sent Moses to Pharaoh, and Moses said, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go free. Yeah. Or words to that effect. Pharaoh said, no. And he kept saying that. But God can be pretty persuasive. He struck down Egypt with 10 plagues. You can read all about those in the Bible. But eventually Pharaoh let the Israelites go. God led his people out of Egypt, parting the Red Sea for them on their way so they could walk across the dry land with a big wall of water on either side of them. It was a bit of a miracle, but God can do that sort of thing because he's God. God told the Israelites how they should now live, now that they were his people, and he was their God. And he led them across the desert to their very own land of Canaan. Now there was a bit of a blip, 40-year blip in fact, after the Israelites saw the scary people who lived in Canaan and didn't trust that God could look after them, and so they ran away. But instead of taking them straight into the land, God made the Israelites wander in the desert for 40 years until an entire generation had died. But then, finally, a man called Joshua led them. God led the Israelites into Canaan. Now at last, God's people were living in God's place with God's blessing, and they lived happily ever after. Or did they? No, they didn't. You see, this wasn't the end of the story. God's big plan to rescue the world was not finished yet. But more on that tomorrow.